The only Lincoln more unlucky than Abraham was his wife, Mary. Mary Todd Lincoln was an incredible woman who had an unfortunate life filled with loss and heartache. Today we will discuss, first, Mary Todd Lincoln's earlier life and marriage to Abraham Lincoln. Next, some of the struggles that took place for Mary during her husband's presidency. Then, the unfortunate events after her husband's death. Much of the information I'm going to share with you today came from the National First Lady's Library and Historic Site. According to the National First Lady's Library, Mary Todd was born on December 13th, 1818 in Lexington, Kentucky. Her father was a prosperous lawyer, so she was born into and became accustomed to a wealthy lifestyle. Sadly, all the money in the world couldn't make up for the amount of loss she would experience in her lifetime. Unfortunately, that loss started at a young age. Her mother died when Mary was only 7 years old. At 23 years old, she married Abraham Lincoln, lawyer and eventual 16th President of the United States. Mary took a more active role in her husband's political career than most women would at the time. You see, she was significantly more educated than most women of the 18th century. On top of that, Mary was a passionate supporter for the abolishment of slavery, which would later be accomplished thanks in part to her husband and the American Civil War. Her over-involvement in her husband's career was the first reason why the American public began to turn their backs to her. Bigger issues arose when her husband was elected president. Used to wealth, she was an overspender. And according to firstladies.org, due to redecoration of the White House and her love of nice clothing, she went over her budget by $6,000, which adjusted to inflation would be around $123,000 today. To the public eye, she was seen as selfish, overspending during a time of civil war when most families are poor and suffering. Her spending only got worse after the death of a second child. She'd already lost her son Eddie to illness at the tender age of 3. He died only a year after her father passed away. Now her son William had passed away at the age of 11 to typhoid fever, right at the beginning of her husband's presidency and the Civil War. We can assume Civil War is hard, particularly for the president and his family, but harder days for Mary would precede the war and its victory. 5 days after the Union won the Civil War, during a time that should be filled with happiness and celebration, Mary would experience yet another earth-shattering tragedy. On April 14th, 1865, Mary would attend a play at the Ford's Theater with her husband. As they sat together, watching and enjoying the show, John Wilkes Booth walked up behind Abraham and shot him in the back of his head. Her husband was rushed to a boarding house across the street from the theater. A quote from History.com paints the scene well. It reads, "Mary Todd Lincoln paced the parlor alone. She had been banished from the president's bedside by a furious Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who kicked her out of the room when she began to cry hysterically. Nearby, her husband was dying, but his wife of 23 years wouldn't be there to see it." End quote. She never saw her husband again. She was looked down upon by the public because of her displays of grief, which by today's standard would be expected of a widow who just witnessed the assassination of her husband. But during this time, it was viewed as unladylike. According to the Smithsonian, she would be referred to as insane, hypochondrial, menstrual, and the female wildcat of the age. After his death, Mary was removed from the White House. Mary was now a widower, homeless, and adjusted for inflation, $500,000 in debt. Things continued to get worse for Mary when only 6 years after her husband was shot, her son Tad died at the age of 18. Tad's death completely broke her. So much so that according to firstladies.org, her only living son, Robert, had her committed to an insane asylum in 1875, where she spent 4 months of confinement. So now you know, First, Mary Todd Lincoln's earlier life and marriage to Abraham Lincoln. Next, some of the struggles that took place for Mary during her husband's presidency. And finally, the unfortunate events after her husband's death. Mary Todd Lincoln had an incredibly sad life. She was faced with more heartache than most people can imagine. She died of a stroke in 1882 at the age of 63. During her lifetime, she witnessed the death of her mother, father, 3 out of 4 sons, and her husband of 23 years. Because of the grief that came from these deaths, she was shamed, criticized, and publicly condemned by the American people until the day she died.